And joining us now is Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party of Canada and author of Losing Confidence, which you apparently are doing in our system of governance here in this country. More to come. I want to read a quote from your book to get started, then we're going to pull that apart and discuss. Canadians, you write, are not particularly aware that the essence of our democracy is at risk. The essential elements of a functional democracy are a free and independent media, a well-informed and engaged electorate, and high levels of participation on voting day. Let's go through those. Obviously, you believe those elements are sorely lacking right now. Yeah. Do we not, in your view, in this country, have a free and independent media?
We're losing it rapidly. I mean, we saw the first warnings from the Davey Commission back decades ago, Tom Kent's commission in the early 80s, saying that the conglomeration, the concentration of ownership in certain media giants, the vertical control now, where you have a handful of corporations that own most of the commercial television stations, radio stations, and newspapers. So you have a very few set of corporate voices in the world of our media. This is an exception, TVO. CBC, on the other hand, has had so many cutbacks, and the bottom line that affects those large conglomerates to make profits once they've overextended themselves to keep buying up more than they can actually digest. When you go through all that process, we're losing reporters' capacity, we're losing journalistic capacity, so you end up with less and less relevant news coverage, particularly of local events, but also national.
But you're only referring to mainstream media here. We have a proliferation of voices online, which presumably have been increasingly important during election campaigns. Isn't that fair to say?
Well, I talk about that as well. We have some very responsible journalists online in places like the Tyee or Straight Goods or Rabble, but we've also got a proliferation of unmitigated garbage that isn't vetted by anyone for accuracy. You know, the most salacious gossip and outrageous slander can appear on internet sites. And so the ability to have a paper of record, a newspaper you can trust that's actually going to tell you what's going on. People rely on that, particularly the engaged electorate connection to reading a daily newspaper is very strong. And if you look at countries where you still see a lot of people voting, they also tend to read a daily newspaper or more than one. So I think it's a serious declining sign in our democracy. And then, of course, I talk about in the book the fact that I think at least some parts of some networks went overboard in actually working to create news that assisted Mr. Harper in the last election.
Well, having said that, there's the other side of it, which is a lot of the networks really got on the bandwagon to give voice to those who wanted you in the leaders' debate, and without that, you wouldn't have been there.
Well, without the fact that the network's executives had decided to keep me out of the leaders' debate based on a threat from Harper and Leighton. And that citizen uprising also, that did manifest itself quite brilliantly.
The executives, you're right, the executives came out behind the scenes against you.
Right.
But the actual reporters who were putting the stories on the air, they were the ones who were giving you a voice.
No question, and I say that, and I'm very clear in the book that I'm not condemning every journalist in this country. That'd be a surefire way to never get interviewed again. I'm actually saying, look, there's a problem in some areas where there is an element of bias. The larger issue is that every conglomerate wants to have a diversity of voices, but we no longer have enough reporters with the resources and the capacity to actually dig for the stories and provide a Canadian take on all the relevant, important events.
Okay, you ask an interesting question in the book, well, many interesting, but I'll point this one out right here, on the issue of voter turnout. And you ask the question, do you think our political parties really want high levels of turnout? And I suppose it never occurred to me that they wouldn't.
Yeah.
Why would you say that they don't?
Well, I'm convinced that Mr. Harper deliberately manipulated a number of factors to have lower voter turnout because it was of assistance to his party. So, for instance, calling an election on a snap basis, breaking a fixed election date law, especially after he'd called several by-elections, which definitely created the impression we weren't going to the polls for at least another few months. And having voting day the Tuesday after Thanksgiving weekend, having just passed an elections law which made it much harder for people to vote because they needed a photo ID government issued that also included a current street address. Not all government issued photo ID.
But if those things are so nefarious, presumably his vote would be suppressed.
It was.
And the others not necessarily so, because they'd want to rise up and throw him out for all of this shenanigans.
Well, I mean, the voter turnout piece that Harper worked the hardest at is the one I haven't mentioned, which is attack ads against Stéphane Dion, which, according to the analysts in the polling business, had the effect of keeping liberals home. So while Mr. Harper did, in fact, get he got 170,000 fewer votes in 06 than in 08 than in 06, with more seats. Every other party, except the Greens, we are the only party that got more votes. All the other parties lost proportionally more votes than Mr. Harper's strategy cost him.
But you think that all of the mainstream parties
Well, I don't think all of them. I don't
want
think all
fewer
of
people
them.
voting?
No, I don't think all of them by any means. I think that I imagine that Jack Layton and the NDP would like to see more people voting. Higher voter turnout helps those parties where people want to believe in change. And lower voter turnout reflects public cynicism and disengagement and a sense of disempowerment. And we have to really, I'm, by the way, not losing confidence, even though that's the title of my book. I actually believe, with the examples such as the public outcry that got me in the debates, that Canadians can engage and get angry. Pointed out the other day, they really took offense at the way Billy Bob Thornton treated Jian Ghomeshi. We can get outraged about things, but let's get outraged during elections and get out to the polls. So it takes an awareness that we've got a problem to fix the problem.
Well, yours and Jeffrey Simpson's book, The Friendly Dictatorship, shine lights on the way that governance works in this country. And I want to quote, I guess, one commentator in your book who said, "We seem to have created in Canada a presidential system without its congressional advantages." What do you mean by that?
Well, in the United States, as a result of the American Revolution, a small event in which they got rid of the king, they said, we've got to watch out for abuse of power. So we're going to separate out what the president can do as the executive away from the legislative powers, which will be in the House and the Senate. Canada never did that. The UK never did that. In a Westminster tradition of constitutional monarchy, in our democracy, the Prime Minister's government, the government of the day, is executive, legislative, all in one. When Mr. Harper concentrated power to such an extent that not only do his backbenchers have no power, his cabinet ministers are effectively vestiges of some previous function. So you have all the power of legislative and executive in one person. And where are the checks and balances? Our system didn't create them.
Well, in fact, some people may not remember, you actually worked for a progressive conservative cabinet minister in Brian Mulroney's time. And you tell us in the book that the speeches in those days by the ministers did not need to be vetted by the Prime Minister's office. If you wanted to give one, you just went and gave one?
Absolutely.
And it's not that way anymore.
No.
Why was it better in your day?
Well, actually, and I think I made the point through the book that it looks that during the Martin and Crétin years, speeches weren't vetted. So this control is extraordinary. I was speaking the other day in the United States where at a Canada-US seminar for university students, they said they really missed the older days because they used to be able to get the consulates from Canada to come speak to the students, but they weren't allowed to anymore. There's something quite wrong with that bottleneck of control in the Prime Minister's office that doesn't trust his own ministers that he's selected himself to give a speech, to talk about policy, to shut down senior civil servants from giving a speech or talking about policy. It's not healthy.
Another example you give, John Turner, when he was the Justice Minister back in the 1970s, he apparently would sit down with his opposition critics and they would sort of hammer things out, and by the time the bill got introduced, it was much more smooth sailing because all of the hard stuff had been worked out. Does that happen at all anymore?
I don't believe so. I haven't seen any sign of it, certainly in the Harper years. And you know, John Turner reflected on the fact that when they sat down, he'd have them for dinner. They'd open a bottle of wine. He'd say, well, I want to make this change to the criminal justice system. What do you think? He'd ask the critic for justice in the conservative ranks and in the NDP ranks. And then they would share drafts. He said by the time it was introduced for first reading, it was as good as passed. It was consensus. That's the nature of parliamentary democracy when it's working properly.
Why can't it happen today, though?
I think that the problem lies not so much in the personality of Stephen Harper, although that's a particular problem, but in the rise and the power of organized political parties. We've allowed partisanship, which was always quite evident during elections, to take over all the time. So it's never about governing. It's always about electioneering.
And in fairness, I don't think you can just go after Harper on this one, because I know I went to an event at Queen's Park the other day and the McGuinty government was unveiling some new piece of legislation about labor mobility, which seemed fairly innocuous enough. And I asked whether or not, having just read your book, I asked whether or not the critics were brought in and had their views been taken into account. And no. I mean, they were informed of what had been introduced, but this doesn't seem to happen anywhere anymore.
No, and I think this is why I said it's not just Harper. The rise of political parties and the power and clout of political parties tied to very sophisticated messaging and communications professional advice has shut down the extemporaneous outburst from politicians. Now, the people in control like that a lot because it saves them from embarrassing moments, but it also means that they're not really working in the parliamentary tradition. They're not working across party lines. I give a lot of anecdotes in the book for what it was like. I mean, I may be over-romanticizing. Some people say I am the Mulroney years, but when we were working to save South Moresby, which is now Guayhanas National Park, I was on daily on the phone with the NDP environment critic, with the Liberal environment critic. We were pulling together as one team to get something good to happen, and we did it in a system that now is so poisoned by partisanship that that simply couldn't happen.
Let's talk about whether or not there's a better way to elect you folks. Let's bring up this graphic if we can, Michael. You tell us that from the beginning of the country, 1867 to 1920, there were in fact no minority governments. And then from 1920 to the present, I know we tend to think of it as rare, but in fact there have been 13 minority governments. And from 1920 to the present, we've actually had what you call 12 false majority governments, meaning the party who won got the majority of the seats without actually getting a majority of the votes cast. Let's go to the next graphic as well, where we talk about the last election, 2008, where the Bloc Québécois got 1.3 million votes, good for 50 seats. New Democrats got 2.4 million votes, in other words, many more, and yet got fewer seats, 37. And of course, your party, which was the only one to increase its vote tally from the previous election, got just under 1 million votes, good for no seats. Okay, here's my question. Everybody knows this first past the post versus proportional representation. We've had lots of discussions about this on this program and throughout the country. No majority government, of course, is going to legislate itself out of existence, but we've had minority governments now for 5 straight years, which you would think would be an ideal time for the smaller players in the House to insist, as a going forward basis for their support, that some kind of PR system be brought in because it would be helpful to them. Why hasn't it happened?
You know, the ideal time was when Jack Layton was dealing with the minority government of Paul Martin and could basically, I think, have gotten anything he wanted within reason, and this is certainly within reason. There's very good and solid reason to pursue it. I don't know why they didn't pursue it then, because it's NDP official policy to favor proportional representation, although if you look at the BC NDP and the referendum on single transferable vote attached to the provincial election, May 12th, the NDP is working against it. So the moment of decision is what's in our best interest right this minute, instead of, and this is not just the NDP, this is contaminating politics in general. The decisions that are made about when to call an election, what should we do right now as parliamentarians, is overwhelmed by what's in the best interest of my political party this minute. And so, yes, obviously one of the parties that's smaller and in opposition is the Bloc. The Bloc would be wiped out by proportional representation.
So we know they're not going to support it.
So they're not going to support it. The NDP officially supports it, and the Liberals still are in that view of it's us or the Conservatives. So in a strong two-party system, first past the post works fine for those strong two parties, which is why Carol James and the NDP worked against something that they supposedly were in favor of, proportional representation. It really takes a citizen push. If you look at New Zealand, where they changed the system to proportional representation, and we're in a system exactly like ours as a Commonwealth nation with a parliamentary democracy. To get that change, it took voter dissatisfaction that squeezed a party in opposition enough to get an electoral promise out of that party that they would revisit the system and change voting when they came to power.
Would it disturb you not to know who won the election on election night? I mean, that's one of the concerns people have.
It was a shock for people in New Zealand. It was interesting for me doing this research to find how it had gone over New Zealand. They had a parliamentary royal commission. They had a lot of visits throughout the community. They had lots of hearings, lots of briefs. The New Zealand public was only required to pass a referendum by a simple majority, 50% plus, and they went to proportional representation. And the first time they had an election and then had to find out who was government, and it took a while, there was a bit of surprise, but they've adjusted to it. They've had longer, more stable governments than we have with first past the post. They've had every vote count. People actually voted for parties that they see reflected in the House of Commons in New Zealand. So I think there's going to be adjustments with any system of voting, but it's certainly fairer and more democratic and avoids, you put it up there, the false majority. I've got to give credit to Peter Russell, the U of T professor emeritus of political science. His book, 2 Cheers for Minority Government, I cite repeatedly in mine, but his point is what a risk it is. When you have a system with no checks and balances, when a prime minister in Canada is essentially unfettered in his powers, or potentially her powers, we do not want to have a system where the minority of votes can pass a huge majority of seats. That is a far bigger risk in first past the post than minority governments.
Although, let me hearken back to the leaders' debate that took place before the last federal election.
I remember that.
Well, you were there. And you were asked, I think, if you became prime minister, what's the first thing you'd do? And here's what you said. Roll tape.
My question is, if I should elect you Prime Minister, what's the very first thing that you're going to do when you get into office?
Top of the list is we've got to fix our electoral system. We've got to put ourselves on a path to proportional representation so that the will of the voters as expressed in the way people vote is reflected in the House of Commons. And we don't run the risk of false majorities, such as a majority of the seats with a minority of the support.
Now, some people that I spoke to after that debate said, Elizabeth May is just like all the rest of them. The first day she becomes Prime Minister, the first thing she's going to do is change the system to help her own political partisan interests. A, is that a fair observation? B, do you regret giving that answer?
Absolutely not. I'm very pleased. I hadn't seen it forever. I have never watched the debates. Look, the parties that get into power tend to perpetuate the way in which they were elected. Doing what I just committed to do would be that it was the first political party elected to power that was prepared to risk that power for something fairer. I'm very proud of that answer. Wouldn't change a thing, and I think whoever said that to you wasn't thinking through the fact that if once you're in power, this is what Stephen Harper said to me once when I talked about this. He said, well, a political party very rarely wants to, and members of Parliament don't want to change the system by which they got there. To get to power as a Green Party MP and Green Party Prime Minister, I would have to get elected through first past the post. And at that point, other political parties before us have pulled up the ladder and said, fine, we're all right, Jack, it worked for us after all. You have to stay committed to principle. You have to change that voting system.
But I think people, it wasn't just one person, it was several people who said, you know, she's been talking about global warming for so long and cleaning up the environment, the first thing she would do is change the political system. They just felt it missed. For what it's worth, so I'm giving you a chance to speak to it.
Well, I mean, obviously, the second thing I would do is bring in everything we need to do to respond to the climate crisis. I am a multitasker, and I would have several very busy days. But I think the voting system is such a risk in our democracy that one mustn't miss the chance to correct the deficiencies of a very archaic system that, you know, this is a crisis. When only 58% of Canadians vote, which is what happened after that debate, 58%, that's an all-time low, and that's dangerous in a democracy. Democracy is necessary to resolve and solve the climate crisis. That's the premise of my new book. We can't solve any problems in our society if democracy is dysfunctional.
But here's another quote from your book. A political party leader's job is to advance partisan advantages at all times. And I know you say that like it's a negative thing.
It is.
But that's part of the job, isn't it?
That's the part I hate, and that's the part that I think that makes Greens different. That's why I always loved Petra Kelly, who was the leader of the German Greens, who called her party the anti-party party. I think your job must be to protect your party's interests, but the country and the planet have to come first.
Don't you, by giving the answer you gave about proportional representation, give people the impression that putting Green Party interests first is something that you'd be interested in, given the answer that you gave?
The answer was not about putting Green Party interests first. It was about making sure democracy has a functional, effective, life-giving, encouraging way of empowering the public to believe their votes count. It happens to advance the interests of the Greens, but that's not the reason I wrote the book. That's not why I feel so passionately about it. That's not why groups like Fair Vote Canada care about it. It's not about one party. It's about ensuring that democracy survives as a real exercise of power by citizenry over their government.
Okay, let's do one more quote here from the book. Michael, we'll bring up this graphic if we can. Here you go. It is inaccurate to say that Stephen Harper personally has created this nadir in our parliamentary tradition. He is merely the most recent and very worst of any Canadian Prime Minister in terms of his approach. But the trend began long ago, and every recent PM, you tell us, has contributed to this concentration of power. The problem is that the architecture of PMP and PCO, which stand for
Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office.
There you go, have been redesigned to allow prime ministers too much sway. It is unlikely that a new prime minister of any party would begin dismantling the apparatus by which power has been centralized in his or her hands. Restoring the essence of parliamentary democracy requires a change at a fundamental level. So, okay, let's take our remaining moments and have you tell us, how's it going to happen?
Well, I think if we back to proportional representation, that would make a change, because you'd end up naturally having more parties represented, a greater need for cooperation, with an attendant reduction in the power of the partisanship of political parties as organized
no appetite
beings.
in the House to do it.
Well,
apparently.
I think there is. I know that there are individual MPs, and I have friends on all sides of the House. I mean all, including conservative ranks. And when you talk about issues like climate change, what could we do together, there's a real appetite for doing that kind of thing. It's constrained by the top-down control of political masters, by the political party system, by preparation for another election, not by governing in the moment, not by seeing what can we accomplish here in this place to represent the people who've elected us and sent us here, and behaving respectfully towards each other by engaging in a cooperative fashion. I think there's a tremendous appetite from individual MPs to do exactly that.
Okay, what about individual Canadians? What would you have them do?
I think the number one thing is to engage in this question. Why are people not voting more? What's happening to our democracy? What would be the best ways to fix this? Now, if it's not proportional representation, it's at least calling our political parties on this level of control and messaging control. You know, only 84% of Canadians say they don't want to ever join a political party. And yet the people who are in political parties are really controlling a tremendous amount of democracy. The pre-existing question of who will be the prime minister, which in Westminster tradition could be 308 people could have gotten elected October 14th, 2008, shown up in the House and said, hey, that guy Stephen Harper, I don't think he's really a very good prime minister. What do you think? Let's pick that other fellow, Bill Casey. He's an independent. I like him. I mean, in our Constitution, that would be perfectly legitimate. But we are so accustomed to the power of political parties that we're letting them get away with murder.
The title of your book is Losing Confidence, which isn't quite as interesting as the title you were going to use, right?
Yeah.
Where did I read that in the back
Sure,
here? What was it called?
My daughter said, Mommy, no. My working title
Here it
was
is. Canada, Banana Republic Without Benefit of Fruit. It's catchier. Okay.
Like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. That title would have sold the book.
It might have. It's good of you to come into TVO tonight and talk
Steve,
to us. Thanks so
thank you
much,
so
Elizabeth
much.
May.